The story of Rome and Parthia begins in the shadows of empires rising and falling, of desert sands meeting marble cities, and of a world where power was measured in armies, cunning, and ambition. In the West, Rome had emerged from the chaos of the Republic, a city of laws, citizens, and legions that carved their influence across the Mediterranean with unmatched discipline. To the east, Parthia rose from the ashes of the Seleucid Empire, a realm of mounted warriors, archers, and kings whose mastery of cavalry made them nearly invincible on their own terrain. These two powers were separated by deserts, mountains, and rivers, yet destiny would draw them into conflict, a clash of cultures and tactics that would echo across centuries. Rome, with its meticulously trained legions, had learned to subdue city-states, conquer hostile tribes, and bend the Mediterranean world to its will. Their strategy relied not only on brute force, but also on the integration of conquered peoples into a system of governance, taxation, and loyalty. Parthia, in contrast, relied on speed, surprise, and mobility. Its cavalry, armed with composite bows and trained from childhood, could strike like lightning and vanish into the arid expanse before a Roman cohort could close ranks. Their rulers, seated in palaces that shimmered in desert sunlight, wielded authority through alliances, intimidation, and subtle diplomacy, balancing power between noble families and tribal confederations. The first significant collision of these titans came at the hands of ambition. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome and a man desperate for glory, turned his eyes eastward. Rome's conquests had largely skirted the lands of Mesopotamia, leaving fertile valleys under Parthian influence. Crassus imagined himself as a hero of Rome, a man who would eclipse even Caesar and Pompey, and in 53 BCE, he marched his legions into unknown deserts, confident that Roman discipline could overcome any foe. The Parthians, however, were waiting. They struck with precision, drawing the Romans into narrow passes, bombarding them with arrows that darkened the sky, and retreating when counterattacked, only to strike again where the Romans were weakest. The Battle of Carrhae became a disaster of epic proportions. Roman formations shattered, leaders slain, and Crassus himself met a brutal end, a stark lesson that the might of Rome did not guarantee victory in every theater. This early clash was more than a military defeat, it was a cultural shock. Roman historians marveled at the Parthians' horsemanship, their ability to fire accurately while retreating, and their use of terrain to outmaneuver the legions. Legends grew around the Parthian shot, a maneuver where an archer on a galloping horse would turn his body backward to release arrows with deadly accuracy, leaving pursuers helpless. The psychological impact was immense. Rome had never encountered an enemy whose strength was mobility, whose strategy was patience and cunning, rather than sheer numbers or siege engines. In the courts of Parthia, the victory was celebrated not merely as a battle won, but as proof that the eastern lands could resist the encroaching tide of Rome, that their traditions and tactics could survive the ambitions of a western giant. Yet Rome was not so easily humbled. The loss of Crassus became a rallying cry, a blemish on the Republic that demanded vengeance and restoration of prestige. Generals, senators, and eventually emperors would look eastward, plotting campaigns that would seek to avenge defeat, extend influence, and secure trade routes. Over the decades, the ebb and flow of war between Rome and Parthia became almost ritualized, with each side learning from the other, adapting, innovating. The campaigns of Marcus Antonius after the fall of the Republic, and later Augustus's careful diplomacy, revealed a new Roman approach. Subdue without overextending, use proxies and client kings, and strike where weakness could be exploited. Parthia, for its part, learned to anticipate Roman tactics, fortifying key positions and leveraging their knowledge of terrain to offset the heavy infantry that had made Rome invincible in Europe. Trade and culture flowed between the empires even amid hostilities. Caravans crossed deserts, carrying silk, spices, and ideas. Roman coins have been found deep in Parthian territory, while Parthian artisans and merchants left traces in the cities of the Mediterranean. These exchanges created a paradoxical relationship. While armies clashed on the battlefield, civilizations influenced each other in ways invisible to generals, shaping architecture, governance, and even art. Yet the looming shadow of war always returned. The struggle was not just for land, but for prestige, for the recognition of supremacy in a world still reeling from the collapse of Alexander's empire. The next great chapter in this saga came under the leadership of Trajan, centuries later, when Rome's empire reached the height of its ambition. Unlike earlier campaigns, Trajan sought not merely to defeat Parthia in battle, but to claim its lands outright. Armies marched along the Euphrates, cities fell, and the Parthian response was as sophisticated as ever: retreat, regroup, and counterstrike in ways that sapped Roman strength. Trajan captured the Parthian capital for a brief, shining moment, but the logistical nightmare of holding territory so far from Rome proved insurmountable. The campaign ended in temporary conquest, but permanent understanding. Rome could invade, but Parthia could endure. And in endurance lay the secret of Parthian power. Amid the shifting sands of Mesopotamia, Parthia thrived not only through war but through a delicate web of alliances and courtly maneuvering. The Parthian throne was a prize constantly contested, where noble families vied for influence, and the king's authority depended as much on diplomacy as on military skill. It was said that the Parthian king could command an army with the sweep of a hand, yet lose power to a clever noble who shifted loyalties in the dead of night. This courtly chess mirrored the open battlefield. Strategy, patience, and timing were everything. The Parthians understood that Rome's legions, disciplined and formidable, were vulnerable not only to the arrow or the sword, but to cunning, to misdirection, and to the unrelenting expanse of desert and river that could turn a straightforward march into a trap. When Lucius Verus took the mantle of Roman leadership in the East, he inherited not only the ambition of Rome, but the bitter memory of defeats past. The emperor and his generals learned from history. Rome could no longer rely solely on brute force. The Parthian War required logistics, coordination, and the subtle use of client kings. Legions moved along fortified roads, supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles, and diplomacy marched hand in hand with warfare. The Parthians, ever adaptive, did not confront Rome in open fields when it suited them to avoid unnecessary risk. Instead, they harassed the borders, raided supply lines, and struck with precision where Roman authority was weakest. Cities such as Seleucia and Ctesiphon became not only battlefields, but symbols of the struggle for legitimacy, each conquest celebrated, each loss mourned, each negotiation fraught with tension. The siege of Hatra epitomized the futility of conquering the unconquerable. Trajan and later Roman generals learned that Parthian fortresses were designed not merely to repel attackers, but to break their will. Hatra's walls rose like cliffs, defended by men who had mastered every inch of their terrain. Roman engines of war pounded endlessly, battering ram after battering ram, but the Parthians had prepared in advance. Underground tunnels, hidden reserves, and the relentless patience of defenders forced the Romans into prolonged stasis. The siege became a psychological trial as much as a physical one, testing endurance, leadership, and the very limits of Roman ambition. Ultimately, the Romans would withdraw, carrying not victory, but the humbling lesson that not all conquests could be claimed with a sword. It was in the shifting alliances, however, that the story of Rome versus Parthia truly unfolded. Neighboring kingdoms became chess pieces, sometimes loyal to Rome, sometimes to Parthia, and sometimes playing both sides to survive. Armenia, seated between the two powers, became the perennial battleground of influence. A Roman-backed king would ascend, only to be replaced by a Parthian-backed rival. Diplomats and generals alike knew that the true battle was often waged not with swords, but in palaces, councils, and secret meetings under starlit skies. Messages traveled by courier across deserts and mountains, bearing promises, threats, and bribes, each one a small arrow in the greater war for supremacy. Yet even amid such intrigue, the clash of armies remained spectacular and brutal. The Battle of Edessa, for instance, became a defining moment in the Roman-Parthian saga. Roman legions, advancing with confidence, found themselves encircled by Parthian cavalry, whose mobility and archery shattered formations and morale. The Roman standard-bearers fell one by one, the disciplined cohorts unraveling under relentless pressure. Parthian horses, swift and tireless, carried archers who fired with deadly precision, retreating and circling as if guided by unseen forces. The Romans, trained to hold lines, found themselves outmaneuvered, caught in a dance of death where every step forward invited a storm of arrows, every charge met with a feint. In the aftermath, tales emerged not only of the battle's carnage, but of the Parthian audacity and skill, cementing their reputation as masters of the eastern plains. Despite these setbacks, Rome's resolve never wavered. Emperors understood that the empire's prestige depended on action in the east. Military reforms, logistical innovations, and tactical ingenuity became the hallmark of campaigns that sought not merely to conquer, but to endure. Roman engineers built bridges, roads, and fortifications that transformed deserts into marching grounds. Supplies flowed along rivers and canals, ensuring that even in hostile territory, legions could maintain cohesion. Rome's mastery of organization met Parthia's mastery of mobility, creating a dynamic tension that defined centuries of warfare. The mythology of the conflict grew alongside its history. Roman poets and historians wove tales of heroism and tragedy, painting generals as demigods and Parthian warriors as almost supernatural figures. Parthian archers became legends who could pierce armor from impossible distances, while Roman commanders were immortalized for their discipline and stoicism in the face of adversity. Stories of secret messages, betrayal, and daring raids took on the rhythm of epic poetry, ensuring that even those far from the battlefield could grasp the drama and magnitude of the struggle. Trade and diplomacy continued to flow in parallel with war. Silk, spices, and precious metals passed through both empires, and Roman coins found their way into Parthian markets as symbols of both conquest and commerce. Art, architecture, and religious practices were exchanged subtly, leaving lasting imprints. The Parthian influence on Roman military banners and Roman influence on Parthian coinage and city planning testified to the interconnectedness of cultures even amidst relentless conflict. In a sense, the two empires shaped each other as much by confrontation as by cooperation, an intricate dance of destruction and creation across centuries. Even as centuries passed, the tension between Rome and Parthia remained a central thread in the tapestry of history. Generations of generals, senators, and emperors measured their ambitions against the distant lands of Mesopotamia, where the Parthian horsemen roamed and their kings ruled from marble palaces surrounded by desert winds. Each Roman campaign built upon the lessons of the past, a continuous experiment in adaptation and endurance. The legions became more flexible, learning to deploy in response to mobility rather than relying solely on the famous heavy infantry formations that had conquered Europe. Siege engines were refined, cavalry integrated into operations, and scouts pushed forward into the unknown, seeking intelligence on an enemy who moved like the wind itself. Yet Parthia, for all its victories and cunning, faced internal pressures that would ultimately shape the destiny of the East. Its nobility was fractured, with powerful families maneuvering for influence, often undermining the king's authority. Succession crises became frequent, weakening the state just as Rome's organization grew more sophisticated. Still in the hands of a capable monarch, Parthia's army remained a formidable force. Cavalry continued to dominate. Archers executed maneuvers that seemed almost supernatural, and fortified cities resisted siege after siege. The empire's strength lay in endurance, in a culture that prized patience and adaptability, in an understanding that Rome could attack, but Parthia could survive. By the reign of Septimius Severus, Rome approached Parthia with both vengeance and caution. Severus understood that to secure the empire's prestige in the east, he needed more than mere battlefield victories. He required a psychological edge, a demonstration that Rome could impose its will. Campaigns were meticulously planned. Legions moved along supply lines reinforced with forts, and diplomacy worked hand in hand with war. Cities changed hands as the Romans advanced, but they often discovered that conquest was fleeting. Parthian strategies were subtle. Feigned retreats, night raids, and harassment of supply lines ensured that Roman advances were measured, costly, and never fully secure. Even when Romans captured the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, their presence remained temporary, a reminder that conquest in Mesopotamia demanded endurance, not just force. Amid these campaigns, stories of heroism and tragedy flourished. Roman soldiers endured desert heat, ambushes, and relentless harassment from mounted archers. Parthian warriors executed daring raids, sometimes disappearing into the horizon with treasure and captives, leaving behind chaos and fear. Leaders on both sides became larger-than-life figures. Generals who survived multiple campaigns were celebrated as legends. Kings who orchestrated victories against the Romans became immortalized in poetry, song, and the annals of history. Mythology intertwined with reality, each battle expanding into tales that would shape the perception of both empires for generations to come. The rivalry also reshaped neighboring kingdoms. Armenia remained a perpetual flashpoint, a jewel between two giants. Its kings, constantly shifting allegiance, embodied the fragile balance of power that defined the region. Diplomats and spies traveled clandestinely, messages hidden in ornate scrolls or carved into stone, ensuring that every political move had consequences. Persia's rich culture, too, began influencing Roman practices. Coins depicted motifs that echoed Parthian designs, while military tactics subtly adapted to counter Eastern mobility. The cultural exchange, unintentional yet profound, demonstrated that even amidst conflict, the two empires were engaged in a dialogue that transcended warfare. By the early 3rd century, the Parthian Empire, worn by internal strife and constant conflict, faced an existential threat from within. A new dynasty, the Sassanids, emerged, promising to restore Persian strength, centralize authority, and renew the East's challenge to Rome. The Sassanids, inheriting Parthian knowledge of cavalry warfare, fortified cities, and strategic cunning, would prove to be a formidable successor. For Rome, the transition marked both relief and renewed uncertainty. Decades of campaigns against Parthia had taught lessons in logistics, diplomacy, and cultural understanding, but a new enemy meant the cycle of war, adaptation, and legend would continue. The rise of the Sassanids illuminated the enduring nature of the Roman-Parthian rivalry. It was never merely a struggle over territory, but a contest of civilizations. Roman writers and historians chronicled victories and defeats, shaping the narrative to glorify discipline and valor. Parthian and later Sassanid chroniclers celebrated cunning, endurance, and the mastery of terrain. Across centuries, the East and West had engaged in a dialogue of war, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that created a legacy both brutal and beautiful. Trade routes flourished, even amidst sieges. Art and architecture evolved, and the mythology of archers, generals, and kings continued to capture the imagination of future generations. Legends of the Parthian shot, of Roman perseverance in the desert, and of kings and generals who dared to challenge destiny became immortal. Tales of betrayal, courage, and endurance were told and retold, often embellished until they transcended mere history to become stories of almost mythological proportions. Young Roman soldiers learned of Carrhae and Edessa not just as battles, but as lessons in humility, adaptation, and strategy. Parthian youths grew up hearing of their ancestors' victories, their king's cunning, and their warriors' skill, building a cultural memory that reinforced identity and resilience. As the Roman Empire looked eastward, the lessons of Parthia remained clear. Success was not guaranteed by strength alone. Terrain, mobility, strategy, diplomacy, and culture were as decisive as numbers and weapons. Rome had learned, slowly and painfully, that the East could not be conquered in a single campaign, that victories were often temporary, and that endurance and adaptability defined true supremacy. Parthia had demonstrated that empires could survive even the mightiest of adversaries if they understood themselves, their land, and their people. By the time the Sassanids fully assumed control, the stage was set for a new chapter in the ancient world's struggle for supremacy. The lessons of Rome versus Parthia would echo in every encounter, in every siege, and in every negotiation. The Eastern question, how to impose will across deserts, rivers, and cultures, would remain central to Roman strategy, influencing decisions for generations to come. The saga of Rome and Parthia, though centuries old, remained a living lesson in ambition, resilience, and the delicate interplay between force and cunning. As the centuries unfolded, the story of Rome and Parthia became more than a tale of battles and sieges. It transformed into a testament to the endurance of empires, the subtleties of strategy, and the interplay of culture and power. The Parthians, masters of mobility and deception, had shown that an empire need not rely solely on brute force to survive. Their ability to endure, to adapt, and to manipulate the rhythms of war inspired both fear and admiration across the Mediterranean world. Rome, disciplined, organized, and relentless, learned in every clash that victory was often fleeting, and that conquest demanded more than courage. It demanded understanding. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty marked the twilight of Parthia and the dawn of a new era. With centralized authority, renewed military strength, and a vision to reclaim Persia's grandeur, the Sassanids inherited the lessons of their Parthian predecessors. They refined cavalry tactics, strengthened fortifications, and revived cultural pride, presenting a renewed challenge to Rome. For Roman emperors, the Sassanid threat became both familiar and unnerving. The East remained a land where ambition collided with endurance, where the lessons of Carrhae and Edessa echoed in every campaign, and where the desert winds whispered the secrets of warriors long gone. Yet even in the shadow of new dynasties, the legend of Rome versus Parthia persisted. Chroniclers immortalized the great battles, the daring raids, and the moments of courage that defined centuries of conflict. Carrhae, Edessa, and Hatra were no longer merely military events. They were stories of human ingenuity, of valor tested against seemingly insurmountable odds. Roman poets celebrated the discipline and sacrifice of legions, while Persian storytellers praised the cunning and resilience of horsemen who could turn the tide with a single maneuver. These narratives, blending history with myth, ensured that the rivalry lived on, not just in the records of empires but in the collective memory of civilizations. Trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange continued to weave a complex web across the ancient world. Even as armies clashed, merchants traveled the same roads, carrying silk, spices, metals, and ideas. Roman coins circulated in Mesopotamian markets, while Persian architectural styles and artistic motifs found echoes in the cities of the Mediterranean. The confrontation of empires became a dialogue of civilizations, an ongoing negotiation of influence and identity. The sword and the arrow were instruments of power, but so too were diplomacy, alliances, and culture. Rome and Parthia had taught the world that supremacy was not merely conquest, but the capacity to endure, adapt, and integrate. The enduring fascination with the Roman-Parthian saga also lies in its human dimension. Leaders, generals, and soldiers were not mere instruments of war. They were individuals whose choices shaped history. Crassus's ambition, Trajan's vision, Lucius Verus's perseverance, Parthian kings' cunning, and the countless unnamed warriors on both sides created a tapestry of human experience as vivid as it was brutal. The desert, rivers, and cities were not passive backdrops. They were active participants in the drama, shaping tactics, testing resolve, and defining what it meant to survive. Every siege, every cavalry charge, and every diplomatic negotiation became part of a living narrative, a story passed down through generations, enriched by legend and lived reality. In reflecting upon the centuries-long rivalry, it becomes clear that Rome and Parthia were not merely enemies, they were teachers of history. They demonstrated the limits of power, the importance of adaptation, and the value of resilience. Rome showed that organization, engineering, and discipline could project strength across continents, while Parthia illustrated that mobility, strategy, and understanding of terrain could preserve sovereignty against overwhelming force. Together, they shaped a world where empires were defined not just by the land they controlled, but by the ideas, strategies, and cultures they cultivated. Even as the Parthian Empire faded and the Sassanids rose, the lessons of their encounters with Rome continued to resonate. Medieval chroniclers, later empires, and military strategists would study the campaigns, marvel at the maneuvers, and draw inspiration from the stories of endurance and cunning. The desert warriors who had defied Rome, the legions that had struggled to impose their will, and the kings who navigated the labyrinth of alliances became symbols of a universal struggle. The quest for supremacy tempered by the realities of geography, culture, and human ingenuity. And so, the story concludes, not with a definitive victory, but with a reflection on the cyclical nature of history. Rome's ambition met the Parthian spirit in a series of confrontations that tested the limits of strategy, endurance, and adaptability. Each empire learned from the other, each campaign leaving traces in the landscape, the culture, and the memory of civilizations. Trade routes flourished even amid conflict. Cities bore the marks of both conquest and collaboration, and legends emerged that would inspire poets, historians, and strategists for millennia. In the end, Rome versus Parthia was not a tale of simple triumph or defeat, but a story of civilizations in dialogue, of human courage and ingenuity, and of the timeless struggle between ambition and endurance. Their rivalry reshaped borders, influenced culture, and forged legends, leaving a legacy that resonates across the centuries. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the marble halls of Rome, the echoes of their conflict remind us that true supremacy is measured not merely by conquest, but by the ability to endure, adapt, and leave a mark upon the world that time itself cannot erase.